Coffee with Coker. My name is Sue Lindstrom, and I will be your moderator today. Immediately following today's presentation, we will have a Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions in the area provided in the GoToMeeting dashboard, and we will address them as they come in or at the end of the presentation. The participant phone line will be muted for today's presentations, and the materials will be available to you along with an audio playback shortly after the conclusion of the session. In addition, as you exit the webinar, a brief survey will pop up, and we would greatly appreciate your providing feedback on this presentation as well as provide suggestions for future topics. Leading today's discussion on who should lead the transformation to value through clinical integration, physicians or hospitals, is our esteemed leader, Max Reibold. Known as an expert in navigating today's challenging healthcare environment, Max's expertise encompasses physician-hospital alignment and clinical integration, development, and implementation, as well as many other areas of expertise necessary in this accountable care era. Joining Max today is Amy Greeter, one of our Vice Presidents of the Financial Advisory and Alignment Services, and Marcia White, one of our Senior Associates for Coker Group. Together, our three speakers will discuss how physicians and hospitals are examining their role in the transformation to clinical integration and fee-for-value-based reimbursement. The discussion will focus on the two approaches to clinical integration and how technology, quality, and finance remain at the center of the discussion, regardless of the approach. Please join me in welcoming Max, Amy, and Marcia in discussing who should lead this transformation.
Thanks, Sue. This is Max Reibold, and it's great to be here with each of you today for our monthly Coffee with Coker. As Sue indicated, we believe we have a very contemporary and very pertinent topic to discuss today and to share these slides and hopefully have some good Q&A that will follow. We'll leave plenty of time for Q&A and look forward to hearing from as many of you as possible that have some questions. I'm going to just do a brief introduction today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who is going to provide the first section of review and share some thoughts with you relative to the accountable care and value-based care, as we call it. After that, I'll be discussing the private practice perspective, and then last but not least, we'll have Marcia to complete the hospital perspective. So we're trying to really look at this from all angles. Amy will also finish the last few slides, bringing it kind of full circle through some conclusions. But again, as I said a moment ago, we believe that this transformation process from value, or to value from volume, as it's often called, is clearly applicable to all perspectives of the provider side, meaning certainly the physician and the medical practice and related entities, as well as all the way to and including health systems. And quite frankly, those health systems include everybody from the smallest critical access community rural hospitals to the large academic and tertiary centers. So with those brief comments out of the way, let me ask Amy Greeter, Vice President in our firm, who performs a lot of consulting services in this arena, to join us and share some thoughts on accountable care and value-based care. Amy?
Surely. Thanks, Max. And thanks everyone who's listening in today. This is, as Max said, a very contemporary topic, but it's also one that we find very exciting and are delighted to be working on throughout the country today. Max is going to get me set up on the third slide that leads into our first section, which is talking about the accountable care era and some of the realities for various healthcare organizations. So one of the things that most people on this call will recognize is that we are in a very critical era of change. And unfortunately, this isn't allowing most people to remain stagnant and instead having to find ways to adapt to the changes that are happening in the environment, the healthcare industry, to continue to be successful. Physicians and hospitals alike have various financial and operational pressures. Physician practices certainly, for the most part, aren't seeing increases in their reimbursements. In fact, the conversation with the commercial payers is often one centered around how much reduction in payment can I tolerate. If you're staying even or if you're getting a slight increase, that's seen as a major win by many practices. Additionally, hospitals are looking at changes in the way that they are reimbursed as well. More hospitals are being asked by payers to assume greater portions of their reimbursement held at risk for various components. Again, we're starting to see some of those value-based payments starting to arise. While many of the hospitals that we work with still have the minority of their payments held at risk or in abeyance for some value component, the percentage of those that are starting to see these components is continually on the rise. And so while you may be saying we're in a community where that doesn't happen, or we're in an organization where that doesn't happen, we're certainly seeing a lot of organizations that were able to say that very same thing a year or 2 years ago that don't have that necessarily luxury anymore. We also know that 2013 was a big planning year, and 2014 is a big rollout year for many of the ACA and other healthcare reform provisions. And so we're starting to see, again, the impact of those implementation initiatives now. So what else are we starting to see these days? On the next slide, we see that, hopefully Max can advance it now. On the next slide, slide 5, we see that one of the things that is impactful for many organizations right now is certainly a look at value. And when we talk about Michael Porter or others' definition of value, typically we look at an equation wherein quality is defined over the cost. So typically most people say that value is driven by the quality per unit of cost. I think one of the interesting things that we talk about often with our clients, and in fact I was sharing with a client last night, was why have we driven ourselves to the point of looking at value? We had been talking about quality, quality, quality for so long, and all of a sudden now the word of the day tends to be value. Where did that come from? And the example that I always give, and it's stolen from a colleague who I will give full credit to, but the analogy we often give is that in 1999, the Institute of Medicine came out with their quality report that stated that we were effectively killing 100,000 people in American hospitals per year. And it caused quite the stir. You know, everyone was all abuzz about the fact that this is an indication of poor quality in the American healthcare system. It's something that we have to do more about. We have to make efforts to make that be obviously reduced and to be positively changed. And I unfortunately won't have you all able to shout out the answer, but maybe you can at your computer or at your telephone. But what do you think happened in the last 15 years between the time when that 1999 IOM report came out and let's say today? Well, the reality is that our quality, at least as measured by that singular metric, has not improved. And in fact, the number of Americans, or a number of people that are killed in American hospitals today, has quadrupled since that time. So we're suddenly looking at 400,000 people. Now obviously that would be, again, using that singular metric, an indication that quality has certainly not improved in a decade and a half in the American healthcare system. But you know what else has happened over the last decade and a half? And this certainly goes to the bottom half of the value equation. And that would be that costs for healthcare are now in excess of 20% of the American GDP. And so, cynical or not as it sounds, all of a sudden when that happened over more recent times, we've had this look at a value equation wherein both quality and cost are key components to what we're trying to drive. So when we try to drive value, not only are we trying to drive quality, but we're also trying to drive efficiencies and cost. And again, a very cynical look would say, well, nothing has changed until the costs got out of control. But the way that I prefer to think about it is that there have been a number of factors contributed to us as a healthcare industry looking at value now, again, on both components. So again, we've moved away from that quality component more to our value component. We're starting to see that happen in a number of different ways through our evolving payment models. So what you are all likely to know is that the way that we're reimbursed is being changed. Right now, we're largely in a fee-for-service environment wherein everything that we do, theoretically, has an additional gain and additional value to us, meaning that we're reimbursed more and more for what we do as we do more and more. We're starting to see, though, again, the increase in risk as we look at the various models that are, starting to come onto the scene. So pay for performance, many of us are familiar with the PQRS program. Value-based purchasing, many of the organizations will be familiar with the Medicare value-based purchasing system, in which there is not a incentive, but rather a withhold of 1+% of available dollars that is then paid back to organizations if they demonstrate true value. Again, we see that being an increasingly risk-based model. Things like bundled payments also involve greater amounts of risk. So I often tell people that are wondering, well, what is a bundled payment? If you've heard of a DRG, which I think most people have, you've heard of a bundled payment, and you're familiar with a bundled payment. So DRGs were one of the original bundled payment methodologies. We're starting to see that evolve to greater and greater programs. Orthopedics is a phenomenal example of bundled payments programs that we're starting to see. So a lot of payers, including our governmental payers, are looking at ways that they can bundle effectively the whole continuum of care into a single payment for orthopedic services. We're also starting to see shared savings programs. What's interesting to me is that gain sharing is no longer a popular term in the industry, but we start to see a lot of that legacy concept exist in a lot of the shared savings programs, wherein reductions in costs are then shared between various entities, including hospitals and physician participants. And then certainly global payments. I think we've all been through this over the last maybe 3 decades, but we're starting to see a lot more of the global payment methodology exist now. So how do we address these evolving payment models? How do we address them? What's common about all of them? And one of the things I would say is that population health management is, in my perspective, seen as a driving force across all of the evolving payment models. So it's no longer okay to provide exemplary care to one person, but rather we want to be providing high quality, incredibly cost-efficient, high-value costs across a population, across the continuum. And so, I always feel that I can't give a presentation if I don't cite the triple aim. So here's the obligatory triple aim slide. But certainly this is really where healthcare is moving, is towards this population health management concept. And certainly the models that we're starting to see in terms of payment really drive that point of focus forward. So let's talk next about the way that we deliver care. And what I would say is that there are 3 different methodologies for transformational care delivery: tactical initiatives, strategic initiatives, and then really the transformational initiatives. You are likely all familiar with the tactical initiatives. Some of these exist today. In fact, many hospitals have gone to a medical directorship or a pay-for-call methodology. Those things had potentially been sufficient to create some form of alignment between hospitals and physicians. But what we see is that in present time, we need different, more encompassing models to help us get to where we need to be. And that includes things, for example, in the strategic initiatives, like co-management, like PSAs, or like employment. Now, I'll stop there quickly and say employment does not have to be the end-all, be-all, get-all. Physicians don't have to rush to be employed by health systems. Health systems don't have to take the monopolistic approach to employ everybody. There are other alternatives that can get us to where we need to be now. So before, the physicians' hearts stop that we work with, we always say this isn't about forcing employment. There are all kinds of ways that this can happen. And some of those, as we see more recently, are the transformational initiatives. Things like patient-centered medical homes, quality collaboratives, clinically integrated networks, and accountable care organizations. And I'm going to let each of my colleagues talk a little bit more about what those mean, how they're different, and how both physicians and hospitals are leading those transformational initiatives. On the next slide, we talk about these ever so briefly and compare and contrast them. Most people are familiar with the NCQA process and the patient-centered medical home concept, which really has a focus on the ambulatory care environment. We're seeing more and more, though, these patient-centered medical homes being encapsulated in our ACO or our CIN models. Our quality collaboratives, our clinically integrated networks, are often agreements that are in place with commercial payers specifically, in which a network of providers, including typically a hospital, hospitals employed providers, other contracted physicians, are engaging with commercial payers to look at payment either on an incentive or on an at-risk basis for our value-based initiatives. So again, moving from our fee-for-service to our fee-for-value environment. ACOs, in the way that we typically define them, look at the governmental payers. So things like the Medicare Shared Savings Program as being one of the key examples of an ACO model. When we talk about those today, you'll see us default to that nomenclature, where CIN looks at commercial payers and ACOs really look at the governmental payers. So finally, where are we going? Where is our tilting ladder bending us within this industry? Well, the reality is that we are faced with a challenge in front of us right now. How do we deliver high-quality care? How do we deliver cost-efficient care? And how do we do this all for an entire population of people when, as I started out by saying, the resources available to do this are becoming more and more limited, are becoming more and more stretched? Well, the question then begs, can private practices or hospitals be effective at responding to all these various changes and challenges with limited resources? Our simple answer is yes. We have found that there are ways that physicians and hospitals can do this by some of the transformational initiatives that I talked about earlier. And we're going to get into now very specific examples of how both private practices and hospitals are achieving success even in the face of a challenging environment. We're going to start out now with the private practice perspective, and I'm going to ask Max to talk a little bit more about this. So Max?
Thanks, Amy, and appreciate that good insight to an overview to this subject today. Our perspective as healthcare advisors that work with private practices as well as health systems throughout the United States and to a certain degree even a little bit internationally is really that there's a place for both the medical practice and even more specifically the private practice, which I'll talk a few minutes about, and then turn it over to Marcia, who will also talk about some of the strategies relative to hospitals and health systems. Now, traditionally, there's always been a little bit of, let's say, different perspectives between the private practicing physician and the hospital health system. We all know that there's not always the level of trust and the level of even respect, perhaps, if that's the right word, that there should be between the private practice and the health system. Our belief is, and quite frankly, this is no different than what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago when our firm started, almost 30 years, is that the two should really work together. But your perspective as a private practice, and I know we have many private practices represented in the audience today, or as a representative from a health system, hospital, may well be that, well, how do we really fit in between the two? How do we mesh the two? Amy already said that employment, at least from the private practice perspective, is not always A, necessary, or B, even the best strategy. But I would say that working together and figuring out a way to affiliate, I'll use that word somewhat generally, is still absolutely essential, particularly as we move into population health management, bundled reimbursement, and so forth. So in this context, I think back, and this will date me, to a song that was popular in the 70s. And the key punchline of that song goes as follows. And you may relate to this depending upon your perspective. It said, "Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you." I hope that's not necessarily the perspective, but you may feel that way. I'm kind of stuck in the middle here. I don't know that I'm a private practice, at least not forever. I don't know where to go. And even if you're a health system these days, you've tried employment, and it's working to a certain degree, and that's good. But do you need to employ? Do you have to employ everybody? Can you afford it? Those are the questions that abound, at least as we see and work with good folks like you across the country. So lest you think I believe either of you are clowns or jokers, because I don't, we are faced with the challenges of working together, and maybe we are a little bit stuck in the middle with each other. So with those opening remarks out of the way, let's move to slide 12. And under the accountable care era, private practices are indeed going to have to evaluate where they fit in. We all know that the challenges, the economic, and really just the day-to-day challenges of running the business of the medical practice are much more complex, albeit overwhelming to many. Younger physicians coming out of training, quite frankly, have very little hesitancy about employment or what we call full integration with health systems. Many physicians who have been in practice for several years, albeit in private practice, are considering employment. But having said that, we're seeing many, many private practices, and usually it's decent-sized groups, not small individual 1, 2, or 3 physician groups that are saying, you know what, we see an opportunity in this new era, as it were, to stay private, but yet to work together and affiliate in other forms. We can be a trailblazer, as it says here on this slide, by taking the current challenges that are out there and working within the new system. Yes, the system that is emphasizing cost efficiency, evidence-based, patient-centric processes. We can accomplish the things that Amy talked about regarding value and moving from volume to value. We have the wherewithal as private practicing physicians to gather data, to be clinically integrated, And yes, at the end of that process, to continue to respect and to work with our hospital partners. And we believe that that is really the most appropriate attitude. Now, the next slide talks about a theme that has been existent for years, and it's still very much apropos today as we strategize towards what to do relative to the private practice. Strengthen numbers through consolidation. Well, there are various ways that you can do that, and we're not going to really drill down a great deal on those today. Certainly, it comes to mind that you could merge. Merging practices is alive and well. We're working on a number of them ourselves and have completed many. But on the other hand, they're complex, sometimes fairly costly. And indeed, are they really necessary? We'll explore that and perhaps some alternatives to merging here in just a moment. But clearly, and again, this was pointed out already this morning, employment, vis-a-vis employment by health systems, hospitals, and like institutions, while still a very viable alternative, and not, let me emphasize, not a bad one, is not always necessary, particularly to achieve strength in numbers. What is necessary, in our opinion, is to have a plan, to understand where you are today and where you need to go, or at least the possibilities of same. Amy and our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Knight, and I were meeting with a group of single specialty physicians, 5 groups last night. And it was impressive to see that virtually all of the physicians from all 5 of those groups were in attendance. And they stuck with us for about 2 hours, listening to several of the, quite frankly, some of the same slides we're presenting to you today. And really the impressive part was whether they choose to do anything or not at this juncture, that they were interested in learning and educating, and realized that collectively in their particular specialty, and you add up their numbers, whether they choose to merge, which is a possibility, or to undertake one of the more likely scenarios, as I'm sharing on the next slide, it was very refreshing to see those physicians so attentive and so tuned in to what's going on in the industry, and indeed to eventually develop a strategy. So what could it be? What could be your accountable care era private practice alternatives? Today on this slide, we are placing more emphasis on some types of entities that are not employment or other forms of direct affiliation, though we'll certainly touch on how these entities that are on this slide can affiliate with hospitals in a moment, but not necessarily directly tied to affiliation with hospitals, but more so are truly a private practice alternative. And you'll note there that, at least in this particular discussion, we haven't included merging. Now again, merging is very much a possibility. It's a discussion for another day. But we certainly recognize that that could be an alternative for private practices, to capture that strength in numbers, that consolidation mindset that we just talked about. But what we are seeing, and therefore what we are encouraging you from the private practice perspective to consider, is really an age-old, well, seemingly age-old, it's been around a long time, model of the IPA, PHO type mindset. And then that would follow a somewhat more advanced, let's just say, model that the IPA PHO could be the platform from which to launch. And that would be the Quality Collaborative Clinically Integrated Network model. Now let me say from the outset here, as I get into a little bit more detail on clinical integrated networks and how IPAs could be a part of that, ACOs are definitely a part of the equation too. And just by simple definition, in our vernacular, we typically refer to the ACOs as the Medicare model, the shared savings et al. In many circles, ACOs take on a much more universal discussion to include the private or commercial side. Just again, by definition of ground rules here, we tend to try to separate the two by calling the clinically integrated organizations or networks quality collaboratives on the commercial side. But indeed, provider-based ACOs on the Medicare side of things are very much in play here. So what's the purpose of an IPA in the first place? Well, when they were first initiated many years ago, IPAs were nothing more than a contracting mechanism, a vehicle, to organize mostly private practicing physicians, but indeed physician hospital organizations were often merged or participatory with the IPAs, or in some cases IPAs were even called PHOs or vice versa, essentially the same thing. But their purpose was to represent providers in payer contracting. Along the way, our friends in the federal government got involved, and more specifically the Federal Trade Commission, and many such entities were deemed to be inappropriate, albeit illegal, for antitrust purposes. In the cases that were vetted and presented in this context, the very oversimplified and certainly non-legalized explanation that I would provide you was that you can't really be an IPA or a PHO and represent large blocks of non-merged providers if you're not, quote, clinically integrated, at least for fee-for-service contracting. And of course, back the last 10 to 15 years, everything has been virtually all fee-for-service. So the things that we want to look at and be considered in this concept is the fact that there is, alive and well, certain regulatory issues, and we want to be abreast of those and make sure that we have adhered to them. Now, as a result, the need to be clinically integrated is very much in play here from a legal perspective as an IPA. And in a more advanced state, the IPA is a CIN that is clinically integrated. Now that may sound a little bit confusing, but the slide that I've just pulled up better illustrates what we're referring to. And in that sense, the IPA model today is, if it's clinically integrated and you're negotiating fee-for-service contracts, whether it's single or multi-specialty, we chose to illustrate a multi-specialty IPA on this slide, is or has the ability to represent blocks of providers in contracting with payers. Now that's a model that we believe has potential for further advancement in an accountable care era. And indeed, that model, that look, can really become more so the look of a clinically integrated network, which is an option for private practices these days that prevents them or keeps them or allows them, is a better way to state, from being employed or merged into hospital systems. And by the way, it allows hospitals to contract and align with private practicing providers without employing them. Now, in this particular illustration, we provide what we call more of a collaborative structure where all of these provider players are in play here, led by the PHO-IPA that then is connected or becomes a CIN-ACO that could have one or more hospitals, particularly may not be multiple systems as is illustrated here, but certainly multiple hospital facilities within a system. And then in turn, the CIN becomes the entity that contracts with the payers, the commercial payers, and the ACO with the CMS side of things. So the last two slides that I've shared illustrate the IPA, and again, we've somewhat used the term PHO synonymously, of how it can morph, how it can start as your basic IPA, perhaps not even clinically integrated, probably isn't, but can evolve into a CIN. And indeed, that is a strategy for the private practicing physician. Now, when we take it one step further and really drill down on clinically integrated networks, we are illustrating two slides today. The first is the CIN, where you notice, and it's circled in red at the bottom, that the foundational triangle of this particular model is the hospital and health system. As it says there, the base of the model is the hospital health system, but quickly we would add that the contracted network or allied network of providers are both employed physicians and contracted network physicians, which is synonymous with private practicing physicians. So in this particular illustration, while the hospital health system may be the mover, shaker, starter, upper, if you will, of the CIN, even providing a lot of the capital, there can be contracted network providers that are private, and moreover, that circle that says contracted network physicians could be entities that have formed their own CINs that started out as IPAs. So hopefully you can see the progression that I'm trying to illustrate for the private practice. You start perhaps with the IPA, a basic IPA, maybe one you've had in existence for many years. You move it into a clinically integrated entity. At that point, yes, you can call yourself probably a clinically integrated network, just to keep the vernacular straight. And in fact, then work with or affiliate with hospital CINs to ultimately connect with the payers and more than likely negotiate a combination of both fee-for-service, at least for now, and shared savings, bundled payments, some of the new types of payments that Amy illustrated on an earlier slide. Now the next slide is even more progressive from the private practice perspective. And it says, you know, we'll take on a much larger role as the CIN in this whole continuum of provider consortiums, if you will, that negotiate with payers now going forward. And we'll be a much larger CIN. We're not going to be just one practice or one single specialty. We're going to be a much larger, consolidated, strength in numbers entity. And the case study that I'm about to share with you, in fact, illustrates this quite well. And it's a real-life case study. It's not a made-up situation. But in this example, the foundation of the CIN is an allied network of providers. Another way of saying it's a multi-specialty CIN that that invests the capital, that is right there toe-to-toe, if you will, respectfully, of course, with health systems and other provider groups in this new era of reimbursement. So with those illustrations aside here and hopefully in play, let me share with you a specific case study that illustrates this last slide of a large multi-specialty CIN. First, let me give you a little background on the makeup. And again, as I said a moment ago, this is a real-life example. Of course, will remain nameless, and we'll try to make it as protect the autonomy of this entity as much as possible, of course. But we are looking at about a 240 provider, and then, quite frankly, could easily grow to as many as 400 before we're completed. It is multi-specialty, and I must point out that it includes a large degree of primary care. And so that's important for obvious reasons. If possible, if you're going to form a larger IPA that morphs into the CIN that I've been talking about, that it be not only multi-specialty, running the gamut of surgical and internal medicine specialties, but indeed primary care too. The market in this particular case is probably not a lot different than a lot of your markets. Large concentration of Medicare beneficiaries, so we clearly have the ACO in play here. It entails a great deal of cultural diversity. What is the hospital climate made up of? Well, it's both for-profit and not-for-profit faith-based systems, pretty typical. And I don't want to hesitate to point out that there are local hospitals and health systems in this market of this particular entity that are forming their own clinically integrated networks. And you know what? That's great. I applaud them for that. In fact, I would say that is a huge plus to this particular private CIN that we're referring to. And I'll try to connect those dots together here before we end our session through both Marcia's discussion and then the wrap-up that Amy will do. So we do have a fiercely competitive, independent physician community mindset in play here, hence the desire to not be employed heretofore. I will quickly add that the groups that we're dealing with by specialty are quite large. Not all of them as large as others, but at least in a couple of cases we have groups that are 50 or more physicians within a specialty. So they, in and of themselves, represent huge market share that helps as they blend into and become a part of this larger CIN. But even as independent organizations that are, quite frankly, hugely successful today, and let me just say, too, these entities in this example, this case study, today don't need the CIN. They're doing just fine on their reimbursement. You know, relatively speaking, we would all like to get paid more. But relatively speaking, they're doing a fantastic job of contracting on their own because, as I said a moment ago, they're larger entities for the most part. They wield a lot of influence already. But they also have a vision and a healthy respect for where the market is going, and the fact that they do need to become even larger to have a fair and equal seat at the table, whether it's their CIN that's at the base of that model that I illustrated a moment ago, or the health system is at the base. So the motivations behind the IPA becoming a CIN are predictable. They're listed there at the bottom of slide 22, and I don't think I'll spend any more time going through them. But suffice it to say, the vision is there. The education is certainly there on the part of those leaders that have looked to form this private CIN, and the desire to remain independent and free from full integration with the health system, and quite frankly, vice versa. Because most hospitals don't want to or have the capital to employ 240 physicians from both various specialties, including primary care, at least not anymore. So the stars are truly aligned, and what took place? Well, at this juncture, the leadership among these practices has met, has organized, and I will say, too, they educated themselves, and this is so important. I've said this now at least 3 times, but I can't emphasize how important education and really getting a clear understanding to navigate through this seemingly unending maze of detail and what to do is so important. And oh, by the way, it is changing. It could change some more as political climates and changes take place in our country and so on and so forth. This organization did engage third-party experts, both legal and advisory, business advisory, and they realized the value in those areas of assistance. And they went so far as to actually incorporate and create a legal entity with bylaws, with policies, procedures, with governance and leadership within their entity. And so they are poised at this point to pull that proverbial trigger and to move on to a full-fledged integrated organization. And at this point, their efforts to form this legal, integrated, independent network of private practices and achieve some of the things that you see here on this page is very much in play. And yet, to have reached this point and to have organized themselves, they have not invested millions of dollars, at least not yet. And yet, they understand where this might take them and the fact that ultimately it could accommodate a hybrid system of both fee-for-service and more value-based payments. So this process that this entity went through was a step-by-step process. First of all, formation, and then some basic integration concepts, and the ultimate goal, and by the way, the current state of this particular entity is still at those preliminary stages of this middle step on the ladder, and that is the integration processes as outlined on this slide. Ultimately, the goal is, as we've been pointing out, a fully clinically integrated entity that will be able to negotiate either with hospital-based CINs or directly with the payers. And you know, the longer-term strategy for this entity is that they may actually be able to negotiate with some major employers directly. And that's a good thing, too. It's a very good strategy. So physician-based collaboratives are alive and well, and in fact, they're growing. As advisors to these types of entities, as well as health systems, we're seeing unprecedented interest among private practicing physicians and consortiums that are pulling together, doing their education, as I pointed out, and looking toward forming these clinically integrated networks. But indeed, the hospitals have a lot of say and well should. And so Marcia is going to talk to us now a little bit about how the hospital perspective blends in with the things that we've said so far. So Marcia, go for it.
Thank you, Max. So yes, as we talked about a little bit, you know, just from some history, you know, in the 1990s, part of the problem, we had some of the same kind of changes and same kind of talk going on, and it was mostly being driven by the payers. And today we're seeing that this change is now being driven by both physicians and the hospitals. And so, as Amy alluded to earlier, that you know the economic pressures are hitting hospitals. They're at risk for value-based payments, Medicaid expansions, you know, wreaking havoc on them, and then the competition, both regionally and locally, is also having huge, or the hospitals are seeing huge problems. Mostly from not just competition, but we're seeing some of these hospitals, smaller hospitals, being acquired by larger health systems. So there's a big storm that's happening, and with the demographics changing, hospitals not knowing how to manage the payments. And so they're turning to alignments and looking towards aligning their efforts, not just from the hospital's perspective, but they're aligning with, whether it's through a non-employment contract alignment with local private practices. They're seeing full alignment where they're employing physicians and bringing them into the health system and doing that kind of alignment. They're making huge investments in their IT infrastructure so that they can talk between the hospital and the physician practices and the other ancillary areas that they're aligning themselves with. And then ultimately, they're looking towards a care delivery transformation from more of, as we were talking about, towards more of that value-based delivery system. On the next slide, we see that the health system actually is sitting in the middle of all of these different entities, but they are aligning again with the medical staff, maybe bringing them in as employed physicians, aligning them, their system with other ancillary services, even long-term care and allied health services that we haven't seen typically in the past. And all in hopes of wrapping that up into a patient-centered medical home, and then you know, furthering into a total accountable care organization or a clinically integrated network. We also did, or have been working with a hospital. If you go to case number, study number 2, we have been working with a hospital that is actually a health system that is a 6-hospital, 1,250 bed health system. It's a teaching health system, which means they have both hospitals and physicians that are working within that health system. This health system happened to be, in 2009, what I think is ahead of the curve, decided that they wanted to clinically integrate their efforts. So they brought 500 physicians into the mix, decided to start doing large, data-driven, clinically integrated initiatives, and started to work on more of that value-based, quality, value-based outcomes, and then value-based reimbursements. The interesting thing about this group is that most of the times in teaching health systems, we see very siloed service lines. And what they did is they took and sliced it horizontally and said, let's bring in these service lines and have them look at what was the patient experience, and did we have or can we create any cost savings based on looking at a horizontal value-based quality kind of run system. This health system actually was getting it from all sides. Their primary market started to collapse on them. They were seeing huge efforts around them in care coordination. They were seeing that the commercial payer was expanding their medical home projects. Their secondary market, as they started to draw that circle out from that radius, is that they saw even more things happening. Their health system had huge competition from other health systems. They were seeing that the payers wanted to start paying them differently. And then they even drew the circle out further, and they started to see that they had, other people were launching ACO models, that they needed to keep up with these value-based insurance payment plans that were happening. So they were kind of seeing their market, if you will, kind of collapse on them that they had known previously. So the impetus that made them start to make some changes, that they knew that they had to step their game up. And what they started to figure out is that, if you can see, that they had to start bringing in the physicians. They had to actually bring the physicians into this whole mix in order to help them change their care delivery system. And the physician leadership actually was the one that introduced the concept and said, hey, we need to do something different. And they started to propose ideas to the hospital administration to say, hey, we can do things differently. Let's take a look at our ways of how we can clinically make this better. So they asked the hospital board to help start to fund the clinical integration initiative, and they started to focus on the quality and cost efficiency. They organized their goals, and they said we still wanted to remain. They still wanted to remain a physician-based and physician-led organization. They didn't want to be part of the entire fold, but they wanted to align in a way that they remained somewhat physician-based. They wanted to really focus on the quality and cost metrics, and they did that based on specialty. And then they wanted to actively work on how that they could cross over the different specialties. So they looked at, and I'm giving you 4 specific areas that they looked at. They looked at blood utilization. They looked at surgical supply chain. They looked at how can we make our PCMH recognition and network more recognizable. And then they wanted to make sure that their population health management side was actually being used for the people like their employees and their frequent visitors to the ED. They also maintained a goal to work with the payers and to say, if we do this, will you help us contract in a value-based system and reimbursement for value-based. And they did that by trying to bolster their IT and data system, and so that they could share data across the different, between the physicians and the ancillary services and the hospital. And ultimately, all of this is to go forward and develop a really true care process design system. The physicians and the hospitals both had various roles, but they didn't overlap one another. The hospital was there to provide capital to help the physicians maintain, that open communication. And because I think the purse strings of the capital was there. They wanted to have final say in all major matters. But the physicians stepped up and wanted to do the day-to-day operations and make sure that they played that role, that they were going to always be the innovative leaders in those initiatives, and that they ultimately were the developers of the metrics that they were going to follow. So the physicians really stepped up that role. The organization took it to the next level. And because they were already clinically integrated, they still needed to make sure that they were going to be work on that care process design system. And that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time to continue to go down that road. Mostly continuous care process, data-driven, looking at the performance improvement so that they can actually help the caregivers. They wanted to look at, or they want to still continue to look at the quality and what's the patient experience, and is the patient experiencing great things at that health system. And then the last thing is that they really wanted to look at cost efficiency and leading to eliminating waste and doing that without sacrificing quality. And as Amy had pointed out earlier, that's a very difficult thing to do on that ladder, if you will, is to continue to increase your quality and give great customer care and service without reducing the patient safety. They started to do some really great things. Some key takeaways early on is that they found out that by implementing the blood utilization process, they saved a $586,000 or 7% decrease in their total blood utilization costs, which was huge to that health system. The PCMH side, they've already accredited 5 sites, and they're ready to do on 10. They have a huge orthopedic savings where they're seeing significant results, and in fact getting payment back from payers for their value-based reimbursement. So they're actually finally being able to pay the physicians back based on quality. They had a savings in the OR, and then also their ambulatory care team, they had a reduction of bad readmissions after 30 days. I think what hospitals are telling us, though, is very pertinent to this conversation, and that is that they have large access to capital. They have large access to different types of ways to form different types of integrated models. But what they're finding out is that they can't do it without the physicians. And they are finding that these physicians are, as I say, as this slide says, make up the backbone, and that they are the driving force. They're working really hard to do all that they can internally with what they can externally, but they're realizing that clinical integration cannot just be changed by switching how we pay the physicians or switch how we pay the hospitals, but they have to have this whole care delivery system that basically the physicians have to lead. I mean, the hospitals can't lead them. So with that, who is ultimately leading the charge? And I'm going to let Amy talk a little bit about that.
Great. Thanks, Marcia. I appreciate that. So to bring things home for this presentation and still leave us with ample time for our question and answer section, we just wanted to wrap up by talking a little bit about who ultimately leads the change toward value and what are the key steps to success. So our 3 steps for success, the key 3s to engage in, are number 1, to engage physicians, Number 2, to set realistic expectations. And number 3, to focus on changing clinical behaviors as opposed to just checking the box. So regardless of what model you ultimately decide to pursue, we think that these are the 3 things that can really help make sure that you're successful. Let's take a second to talk about each of those 3 in detail. The first is physician engagement. So one of the things that Max and Marcia both talked about is this component of physician leadership, regardless of who is leading or paying for the initiative. And I would just again stress the critical importance of physician engagement. So one of the things that we often see is that physicians not only are more apt to be participative in something that they've helped develop, but physicians can also work a peer pressure that only physicians have with their fellow physicians. So one of the things that we say is that if physicians are really engaged in the process, they've helped set the process, they are going to make sure that regardless of what the model is, they're doing everything they can to make sure it's successful, but also they're going to make sure that they're bringing along their peers and doing everything that they can to bring their peers along to make sure that this is successful as well. So really, when the physicians are engaged, when the mindset is right, when they have the same goals as everyone else and they're working in the same direction, that's really where we achieve the highest potential value in any model. Marcia gave a good example of the level of physician engagement in the case study number 2. But again, I'll just underscore that the gains that they were able to make in that organization and the outcomes that they were able to realize really were very significantly driven by the physicians that helped drive that process. The second key to success is trying to keep everyone equally unhappy. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but really it's important to make sure that you set realistic expectations at the outset for physicians, for the hospital, and for payers. So what can they anticipate to get out of this agreement, and what are they going to be expected to put into the agreement? Be very, very forthright in terms of setting those expectations up front. Make sure that they're not skewed in any way, meaning they're understated, and so people then get in and think, holy cow, this is taking a lot more of my time and monies potentially than I thought, or they're not overstated to the point that there are going to be people who are dissuaded from participating. I often say that sometimes the best meetings, negotiation sessions, are when everyone leaves the same amount unhappy, and that's sort of what I would say here too, is make sure that no one party is any more unhappy than any of the others. So really be careful to balance the level of expectations and the level of investment from your key constituents throughout the enterprise that you're developing. And then finally, number 3, make sure that you are not so intent on developing a structure or thinking about things like patient satisfaction that you get lost in the minutia and that you don't focus on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And that's that you're trying to create a better experience for patients, you're trying to create efficiencies for providers, and you're also trying to make sure that you deliver the highest value product to payers. And those things don't happen unless you are really working on not just setting up a model that's there in name and there in committees and there in boxes that people have to check, but that are really focused on making sure that we have looked at the functional component of what we're trying to change. And again, making sure that we have driven that third key area of success. What I'm going to do now is let you guys, everyone on the phone, have a chance to weigh in and participate in this webinar as well. Sue, I'm going to turn it back to you and to Max to help facilitate our question and answer session. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Amy. First of all, I want to thank Max, Amy, and Marcia for this excellent presentation. It certainly provided food for thought for all of us and hopefully for our audience as well. We did get several questions in, so I'm going to pose them and then I will allow the three of you to respond. The first one we have is a two-part question, and it says, we have an IPA in place, but essentially it is used for support, services support, and messenger model contract negotiations. What should we do strategically and tactically to use this IPA to respond to accountable care?
This is Max. I'll jump in and then defer to Amy and Marcia for any other comments. I appreciate that question. Obviously, shows that there was a lot of attentive people in the audience. The strategic and tactical, if I heard the words correctly, strategies or motives for an IPA to respond to accountable care these days, I would say, as I said in the actual formal presentation several times, the first is to really educate and make sure that all of your constituent providers understand as best you can these days. No one can be a complete expert, I don't believe, but really where the industry is headed and why this is even important. There are many physicians that, for whatever reason these days, and I'm not being critical when I say this, really just don't understand that we are moving away from this fee-for-volume paradigm of reimbursement, and we are going to have to do some things that are different. I think the next thing would be to evaluate the landscape that's in your market. So in other words, really understand, and markets are very different. Some are much more involved and advanced, as it were, when it comes to developing clinically integrated organizations and even taking on shared savings programs as the private insurers are providing, as Marcia illustrated in case study number 2. The third thing I would say is assess how much capital potentially this is going to require. IPAs are historically undercapitalized, and as a result, there is a tremendous amount of lack, if you will, as these things are being formed. Well, where are we going to get the money? Who are we going to get it from? There are private equity funded CINs these days that are existent, and they're coming more and more into play. That may be a strategy, for example, where you have huge amounts of capital that are invested by private investors in equity funds that are putting this money up, and they believe in the, I guess you'd say, the risk that are out there to form these CINs to put that money up and provide the capital. Last but not least, or really the last two things, and quickly I'll be short here, is really come away with a near, mid, and long-term plan would be what I would say. Know kind of where you're headed, at least near term, which may be fairly austere and limited for the moment based on your market, but also understand your mid and long-term end goals, as case study 1 illustrated. That organization, I assure you, has a near, mid, and I think even becoming to have a long-term plan. And last but not least, be nimble. Don't realize or think that what you have today is exactly the final ingredient. I'll just stop there. Anyone else want to add to those points? If not, we can move on to another question.
I think that was well said.
Okay, Max, this question has come in specifically for you, I believe. Has the medical profession been deprofessionalized by employment? They have a fiduciary responsibility to patients, but now the employer calls the shots. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question, and I know for a fact that my two colleagues can also answer it very well, so I'll just be brief and say no. I don't think the medical profession has been deprofessionalized via employment. And I'll just say, and then turn it over to perhaps Amy next, that What we're seeing in most of the employment plans, and I will say most, not just some or many, is that the physician is at the table as well, he or she should be, in governance and decision making, both clinically and even operationally. And we believe that's the way it should work. So, Amy, you want to pick up from there?
Sure. You know, I would say that we have been blessed to see some very exemplary employment models. We've also seen some where there is some advantage being given or taken. So either the hospital is getting taken advantage of, which does happen, or the health system is giving way to the advantage of the physician. And so like everything in life, there's all kinds of different models and all kinds of different ways it plays out. In the best sense of the word, however, which I will say is by far the majority of the employment transactions and arrangements that we see, the physicians are engaged in employment as a way to provide them with the support that they need, to where they don't have to be focused on running their practice, but can really focus on being strong clinicians. And I think that's great. It's like having, you know, a CEO or an office manager that stands behind you and supports you. I do know that a lot of physicians, however, struggle with the transition to employment because they do feel like they're giving up everything that they've worked for, or they're giving up their autonomy, and suddenly they're just another cog in the wheel. You know, there's just somebody that produces widgets for kind of the corporate man. And I do think that that's unfortunate. I hate it when physicians see sort of that way, or that they have lost their love of medicine. But I would say, again, that is the minority of situations that we see, and most are very, very exemplary professional type structures. Marcia, do you want to weigh in too?
Yeah, just really quickly, I can see that could happen, that feeling could happen, and I really believe that the hospitals are realizing that they can't advance their care delivery transformation without the physician sitting at the table. And so I think where you might have that feeling might be where hospitals haven't realized, or health systems haven't realized, that the physicians are the push or the impetus for the change, not necessarily the hospitals. And we're seeing that happen across the country as well.
Great. Okay, our next question. Do IPAs and or CINs carry the same antitrust risks that mergers entail?
I can take that one. This is Amy. I'll jump in. So one of the things that we are very, very mindful of is making sure that we are always on the right side of all applicable regulatory and compliance considerations. And so one of the considerations we have is, okay, do some of these novel or contemporary structures in any way go against Stark or anti-kickback or antitrust or anything else that may be applicable within the healthcare industry? I think many of us know that when Advocate Physician Partners was formed, that they had a little bit of a rocky road in terms of the relationship with the FTC and the DOJ, saying that there wasn't enough clinical integration that was being modeled to really warrant the activities of the organization. So everyone has, I think, taken heed of the fact that these new structures are certainly not going to be exempt from the scrutiny that exists for any other type of healthcare transaction. The good news is that Advocate restructured and came out better, stronger, is still in existence today, doing great things in the greater Chicago area. But there certainly are risks that have to be considered in the IPA or the CIN model. One of the good things that happens is that it doesn't always have to be a singular merged practice that is the composition of the CIN. So in that way, a lot of the issues that exist relative to mergers aren't in play within the CIN process. So that's good. But there are still, again, very definitive definitions for clinical integration, and certainly still a very long stream of regulations that have to be met. Max or Marcia, anything to add?
No, I think you said it well, and antitrust is alive and well, and we need to be cognizant of it. And clearly, merging practices is more difficult. Even in some instances, full integration with health systems and practices has been challenged by antitrust, and so it clearly is a hurdle. Many would say that it's inconsistent with the FTC versus the OIG and CMS et al. In terms of their points of view, particularly as it relates to ACOs, but we'll let the courts and the attorneys and so forth vet that. And but again, heightened awareness is certainly warranted.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this looks like it has come in from a member of an IPA. What to do when the hospital does not want to work with the IPA? They're convinced that owning practices is their only option, so we have accepted that working without the hospital is our only option.
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate situation, and I would hope that at some point in the future, and the questioner may well say, well, we've tried endlessly, but at some point in the future that would change and the two could work together. I guess my advice, if that is not changeable, would be to continue to go down the road to form your own clinically integrated network, be abreast of what the market requires, both now and longer term, vis-a-vis bundled payments and population health management, and then ultimately hope that with your power and consolidation in your CIN that you'll be able to have a better communication and even potentially affiliation strategy with the hospital, because you will need hospitals, they will need you. It's unfortunate that there's not the desire to work together. But I would continue down the road in your privatization strategy and then obviously see where that takes you. I assume there must not be any other health system options in your community. If there are, then certainly that would be another strategy that you should look at to see what else might be availed. There could even be some regional affiliations that may not be directly in your community, but you would want to look at too from a contractual basis. But the larger IPAs that are forming and becoming CINs are clearly going to have a seat at the table, and respectfully of our health systems, we hope that they'll recognize this. Those that only want to employ physicians, I believe, are really not headed down the right road. That's just my personal feeling. I'm talking about hospitals now. I think you should have a pluralistic approach to alignment and integration, meaning that in some cases employment makes perfect sense and is the right thing. In other cases, it does not. And so I think we should just hopefully encourage that health system to revisit their position.
Great. Well, on behalf of Coker Group, I want to thank all of our attendees today who participated in our monthly Coffee with Coker. As you will see, Max, Amy, and Marcia's contact information is available on our last slide, and if you do have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The slides to the presentation and the audio link will be available to you shortly, and please check back soon at www.cokergroup.com for details on our next Coffee with Coker in June. Again, thank you for your participation, and have a great day.